So imagine that time in your life that you dreaded the most when you pass from this life into whatever's next. Imagine you're out of this physical body, but you have a new body. And that's one of the commonalities, that we're out of this body, but we have a new spiritual body. And they say not just with 5 senses, it feels like more like 50 senses. It's the most exhilarating experience that you've ever had. And people say that initially they leave their body, but they remain in the vicinity so they can describe the resuscitation attempts that were happening. In chapter 2, I write about skeptical doctors that were convinced that this is real because of what people reported that they couldn't have otherwise seen. Like cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabin was one I talked to who didn't believe that near-death experiences were a real thing. He said, before talking with Pete, one of his patients, and scores like him, I didn't believe there was such a thing as a near-death experience. Pete told me he'd left his body during his first cardiac arrest and had watched my resuscitation attempts. When I asked him to tell me exactly what he saw, he described the resuscitation with such detail and accuracy, I could have later used the tape to teach physicians. He said these people like Pete Morton saw the details of the resuscitation they could not otherwise have seen. One patient noticed a physician who failed to wear scuffs over his white shoes during open heart surgery. In many cases, I was able to confirm the patient's testimony with medical records and the hospital staff. And Dr. Sabin studied these for 5 years and then ended up writing a book on why he was convinced it was real and published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Dr. Jeff Long, a radiation oncologist, read it there and thought, no, this is BS. Never heard of this, but he started asking his patients. And what you find is, people who've had this experience are very hesitant to talk about it because people make fun of it. They think they're crazy, but it's realer than real, if you can imagine that. Jeff Long ends up studying, Dr. Long studies 1,000 of them and says this, by studying thousands of detailed accounts of NDEers, near-death experiencers, I found the evidence that led to this astounding conclusion. NDEs provide such powerful scientific evidence, it's reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife. And what they found across the globe is reports like in The Lancet, the Europe's most prestigious medical journal. They reported a guy coming into a hospital in Holland. He'd had a cardiac arrest. He was comatose. They're going to shock him. They go to ventilate him and realize that, intubate him, and they realize he had dentures. So the nurse took his dentures out, put it in the lower drawer of a crash cart. They shocked him. His heart started beating, but he never came to an ER. They move him to another room. A week later, he comes to, and he said, I could see everything going on in the ER, even though his eyes were closed the whole time. He was comatose. He described all the nurses and doctors in there, what they did to him, and told them exactly where they could find his lost dentures in the lower drawer of the crash cart where that nurse put them. And these kinds of stories are what led many skeptical doctors to believe there's something real going on here. Now, I believe the Apostle Paul actually had a near-death experience when he got stoned to death in Lystra, stoned to death with rocks. Always have to just make that clear, right? So it's reported in Acts chapter 14. It says this, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town thinking he was dead. But as the believers got around him, he got up and went back into town. Now listen to what Paul says later about that experience. He says, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Why didn't he know? Well, because it feels like ourselves, our real body, but it's a spiritual body. I do know, he says, I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. And Paul goes on to explain that when we die, it's like we get a body upgrade, better than a cell phone upgrade, right? It's like this is version 1.0, we get version 2.0.